I have been following Iran's energy sector for over 15 years, and I have never seen anything like what is happening right now. Something is unfolding inside Iran's oil infrastructure that no one predicted. Not the analysts at the Energy Information Administration, not the intelligence agencies tracking sanctions evasion networks, and not even the petroleum engineers operating the wells in Khuzestan province who are watching their life's work disintegrate in real time. The Islamic Republic's entire economic foundation, the system that has sustained the regime through 4 decades of revolution, war, sanctions, and isolation, is now experiencing a structural collapse that simply cannot be reversed through any combination of diplomatic maneuvering or operational adaptation. The diplomatic pressure was expected. The naval deployments across the Persian Gulf were expected. The financial sanctions targeting front companies and shadow fleet operators were expected. But what is happening right now inside the storage facilities of Karg Island, behind the heavily guarded perimeters of Iran's most critical export terminal, was never supposed to be possible. The United States has executed something that decades of sanctions architecture failed to accomplish, and the consequences are unfolding faster than Tehran's leadership can comprehend or respond to. This is not the slow attrition of previous sanctions periods. This is a precision strike against the economic nervous system of the Islamic Republic, and the damage is structural. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit the subscribe button immediately. Turn on notifications without delay. What unfolds in the coming 72 hours inside Iran's energy infrastructure will change everything previously understood about sanctions warfare and economic coercion in the 21st century. In the next few minutes, this analysis will show exactly how a single calculated American move quietly destroyed Iran's primary revenue stream, why Chinese refineries are now refusing cargo they previously accepted without question, and what this means for the regime's ability to fund its proxy networks stretching across the Middle East. This is not speculation. This is documented reality based on shipping data, satellite imagery, financial flow analysis, and confirmed reporting from multiple authoritative sources working independently across 3 continents. To understand why this moment is so historically significant, this analysis must first go back to 1979. For 46 years, the Islamic Republic built its entire economic identity on one foundational asset: oil exports. Every sanction, every threat, every economic crisis was absorbed and repackaged as proof of the regime's divine resilience because the oil kept flowing. Even during the most aggressive sanctions periods imposed under multiple American administrations, Iran maintained export volumes that sustained the political system. The regime developed sophisticated evasion networks involving ship-to-ship transfers in international waters, falsified documentation routing Iranian crude through Malaysian and Omani intermediaries, and an entire shadow fleet of aging tankers operating with disabled transponders and forged registration papers issued through compromised flag states. According to data published by Kepler, the maritime analytics firm widely cited by Reuters and Bloomberg in energy reporting, Iran was exporting approximately 1.6 to 1.7 million barrels per day throughout most of 2024, generating roughly $50 billion in annual revenue. This revenue stream funded everything that defined the Islamic Republic as a regional power. It funded the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps budget. It paid the salaries of Quds Force operatives across Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. It financed the missile and drone programs that threaten regional stability from the Eastern Mediterranean to the Bab el-Mandeb. It paid for the domestic subsidies on fuel, bread, and electricity that prevent open revolt among Iran's economically devastated population of 88 million people. Roughly 90% of these exports flowed to a single destination: independent Chinese refineries known as teapots, concentrated in Shandong province along China's eastern coast. These facilities purchase discounted Iranian crude at 30 to 35% below market price, generating enormous margins that subsidize their entire operational existence. This arrangement was the foundation of the entire regime survival strategy. As long as the teapots kept buying and the shadow fleet kept delivering, no amount of Western pressure could collapse the system. American officials understood this architecture completely. They watched it operate for years with growing frustration. They imposed designation after designation on individual vessels and front companies, and Tehran simply registered new shells and renamed new tankers within days of each enforcement action. The conventional wisdom held that Iran's oil exports were too entrenched, too profitable for Chinese buyers, and too operationally sophisticated to be meaningfully disrupted through sanctions alone. Multiple think tank reports from recognized institutions, including the Atlantic Council and the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, assess that meaningful disruption would require either direct military action against Iranian energy infrastructure or a fundamental shift in Chinese strategic calculations that seemed unlikely under current geopolitical conditions. That conventional wisdom is now being shattered in real time by a coordinated American strategy that found the precise leverage points the previous approaches missed. The first war is the war on the Shadow Fleet itself, and it is not the slow attrition campaign of previous years. It is a coordinated, surgical decapitation of the entire maritime evasion network executed with precision that has stunned industry observers. According to recent reporting from the Financial Times and confirmed by data from the United Against Nuclear Iran Tracking Initiative, the United States Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control has executed what one former Treasury official described as a fundamental restructuring of how secondary sanctions are enforced. Rather than designating individual vessels one by one and waiting for Tehran to rotate them out of service, the new approach targets the entire ecosystem simultaneously through coordinated pressure on every node in the network. Insurance providers, classification societies, port service operators, fuel suppliers, and the maritime brokers who arrange ship-to-ship transfers have all been placed on notice through coordinated designations and warning letters delivered through formal diplomatic channels. Multiple sources cited by Lloyd's List, the maritime industry's authoritative publication, report that over 100 vessels associated with Iranian oil transport have been effectively grounded in the past several weeks. These are not theoretical paper sanctions. These are tankers physically unable to acquire insurance coverage, unable to receive port services in critical transit nodes, including Fujairah and Singapore, and unable to find legitimate buyers willing to accept the legal and financial risk of receiving their cargo. The mechanism is precision engineered to exploit the structural vulnerabilities of the Shadow Fleet operating model. By targeting the service providers rather than chasing individual vessels, American policy has cut the connective tissue that allowed the entire network to function. A tanker without insurance cannot transit major shipping lanes because canal authorities and port states require coverage documentation. A tanker without classification cannot enter most commercial ports because terminal operators require verified safety certifications. A tanker that cannot refuel cannot complete long voyages to Asian markets because bunker fuel suppliers refuse to service designated vessels. The result is a fleet of aging vessels sitting idle in anchorages off the coasts of Malaysia, Singapore, and the United Arab Emirates, loaded with Iranian crude that has nowhere to go. Satellite imagery analyzed by the maritime intelligence firm Tanker Trackers, which has been cited extensively by Reuters in reporting on sanctions enforcement effectiveness, shows unprecedented numbers of laden tankers in extended floating storage configurations. This pattern is a clear indicator of buyer rejection rather than normal commercial operations because tankers operating profitably do not sit at anchor for weeks with full cargo holds. Each day of floating storage costs the operator between $25,000 and $40,000 in vessel charter rates alone before considering financing costs on the cargo itself. The economic logic of the Shadow Fleet depended on rapid cargo turnover that is now structurally impossible. But the damage went much deeper than maritime enforcement disruption, because what happened next revealed something far more dangerous than the disruption of shipping networks alone. The second war is the war on Chinese teapot refineries, and this is where decades of conventional analysis proved completely and catastrophically wrong. For years, experts assured policymakers in Washington that Chinese independent refineries would never be deterred from purchasing Iranian crude. The economic logic seemed unassailable to every analyst examining the situation. The teapots operated on razor-thin margins, depending on discounted feedstock to remain commercially viable. Iranian crude offered the deepest discounts available anywhere in global markets. Beijing's strategic interest in maintaining leverage over American foreign policy reinforced the commercial calculation through implicit political backing. The arrangement seemed permanent, structural, and immune to American pressure. That assessment has now collapsed entirely. According to recent reporting from Bloomberg, citing detailed trade flow data and conversations with multiple Chinese refinery executives speaking on condition of anonymity, several major Shandong-based teapots have suspended Iranian crude purchases in recent weeks. The reasons reveal sophisticated American leverage that operates below the threshold of formal sanctions but generates compliance through indirect financial pressure applied with surgical precision. Chinese refineries depend on access to dollar-denominated financing, dollar-denominated insurance coverage, and dollar-denominated trade settlement for their broader operational existence across all product lines and markets. Even those willing to risk direct sanctions exposure on their Iranian crude purchases cannot risk losing access to the dollar system that underpins their entire commercial existence beyond the Iranian arrangement. American Treasury officials working in coordination with major international banks across New York, London, and Frankfurt have made clear that financial institutions providing services to entities purchasing sanctioned Iranian oil face escalating consequences extending far beyond the specific transactions involved. The largest Chinese banks, dependent on dollar-clearing relationships with American correspondent banks for their ability to facilitate any international trade, have quietly tightened compliance reviews on refinery clients with known sanctions exposure. Multiple sources cited in Reuters reporting confirm that letters of credit, trade financing facilities, and even routine banking services have become significantly harder for teapots with known Iranian crude exposure to obtain through normal channels. The pressure operates through the financial system rather than through direct legal prohibition, but the practical effect is identical to formal sanctions. A senior analyst at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, quoted in recent Washington Post reporting, characterized the situation as the most effective application of secondary sanctions pressure on Chinese entities in the history of the modern sanctions program. The teapots are not refusing Iranian crude because they have suddenly developed concerns about international law or American foreign policy preferences. They are refusing because the calculated costs of continued purchases now exceed the discounted benefits by margins their accountants cannot justify to their boards. This is precision economic warfare operating exactly as designed by Treasury planners over years of careful preparation. The third war is the war on Iran's domestic energy infrastructure, and this is where the situation becomes genuinely catastrophic for the regime in ways that cannot be undone. With exports collapsing and shadow fleet vessels unable to deliver cargo to buyers, Iran's storage capacity is rapidly reaching critical thresholds across every major facility in the system. According to credible reports citing satellite imagery analysis from the firm Planet Labs, whose data is regularly used by Reuters and Bloomberg in energy reporting, Iran's primary export terminal at Karg Island is approaching maximum storage capacity at a rate that even pessimistic internal Iranian projections did not anticipate. The onshore storage tanks are filling. The floating storage vessels in nearby anchorages are filling. The strategic reserves designed for emergency wartime use are filling with crude that was meant for export weeks ago. When storage capacity reaches absolute maximum, the consequences are not theoretical or gradual or manageable through emergency measures. They are immediate and physically irreversible at the level of the underlying petroleum geology. Iranian wells, particularly the aging fields in Khuzestan province that produce the majority of export crude, cannot simply be shut down and restarted without permanent damage to reservoir pressure and well integrity. Decades of petroleum engineering literature, including peer-reviewed studies published by the Society of Petroleum Engineers, document conclusively that forced shutdowns of mature fields under these conditions result in permanent productive capacity losses estimated at 15 to 25% of pre-shutdown capacity. The damage is structural, geological, and cannot be undone through subsequent investment or technical intervention of any kind. This means Iran now faces an impossible choice with no acceptable resolution path. Continue production and watch as the unsellable crude overflows storage capacity, forcing emergency flaring that wastes the resource entirely while creating environmental catastrophe and international scrutiny that further damages remaining export relationships. Or shut down the wells preemptively and accept that the regime is permanently destroying the future productive capacity that represents its only viable economic future under any conceivable political scenario. According to industry analysts cited by S&P Global Platts, Iran now has only a 10 to 15-day window before this critical threshold is reached at major producing fields. Every single day this situation continues, Iran is not only losing current revenue, it is permanently destroying the asset base that any future regime, reformist or hardline or revolutionary, would need to rebuild the country. The fourth war is the war on regime cohesion itself, and this is where the political implications become most dangerous for Tehran's leadership in the immediate term. The Islamic Republic's internal power structure depends entirely on maintaining patronage networks funded by oil revenue distributed through carefully calibrated channels. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps operates a vast economic empire that includes direct control over oil export operations, shadow fleet logistics through subsidiary front companies, and the financial mechanisms that move proceeds through informal hawala networks across the region. When oil revenue collapses at the scale now unfolding, the IRGC's economic position collapses with it across every dimension of its operational existence. The Quds Force operations across Lebanon supporting Hezbollah's military and political apparatus, across Iraq supporting militia networks that project Iranian influence into the Levant, across Syria supporting the remaining Assad-aligned forces clinging to fragments of territory, and across Yemen supporting the Houthi missile and drone programs, all depend on funding streams that are now being severed at the source. Multiple analysts at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy have assessed that Iran's proxy network operations require approximately $15 to $20 billion annually in direct and indirect funding distributed through cash transfers, weapons shipments, training programs, and infrastructure investments. With oil revenue projected to fall by 60 to 70% if current trends continue through the next quarter, the regime faces an immediate choice between funding its external proxy strategy or maintaining domestic subsidies that prevent open revolt across Iran's major cities. Either choice creates existential risk for the political system. Cutting proxy funding undermines the regional strategy that has been the centerpiece of Iranian foreign policy for 4 decades since the Islamic Revolution. Cutting domestic subsidies risks triggering the kind of mass protests that the regime has barely contained during previous economic crises in 2017, 2019, and 2022, when fuel price adjustments brought hundreds of thousands into the streets demanding fundamental political change. This perfect storm of shadow fleet collapse, Chinese refinery defection, storage capacity exhaustion, and regime funding crisis has created something far more dangerous than any single crisis Tehran has faced before in its history. These are not separate issues that can be addressed through sequential policy responses. They feed into each other through reinforcing feedback loops that accelerate the overall collapse. The shadow fleet collapse fuels the storage capacity crisis by preventing cargo evacuation. The storage capacity crisis emboldens Chinese refineries to refuse cargo they know cannot be reliably delivered through compromised logistics chains. The Chinese defection deepens the revenue collapse that triggers the regime funding crisis across every operational domain. And at the center of this storm sits Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, who has been almost completely invisible from public statements for the past several weeks, reportedly meeting only with his closest security advisors as the situation deteriorates beyond conventional response capabilities. This is the reality of Iran's oil empire in 2026. Not one crisis, but 4 overlapping wars destroying the system from every direction simultaneously and irreversibly. The shadow fleet that took 20 years to construct through patient evasion engineering is being dismantled in weeks through targeted financial pressure. The Chinese buying relationship that seemed permanent and structurally protected is fracturing under banking system pressure that operates below the threshold of formal action. The physical infrastructure that produces the oil is approaching forced shutdown that will cause permanent geological damage to reservoir productivity. The political system that depends on oil revenue is approaching the funding cliff that threatens regime survival in ways the leadership has no contingency plans to address. According to credible reporting from multiple sources, including Reuters, the Financial Times, and Bloomberg, working independently across separate sourcing networks, Iranian officials have begun emergency consultations with Russian and Chinese counterparts seeking financial relief that neither partner appears willing or able to provide at the scale required. Moscow, consumed by its own economic difficulties under Western sanctions and dependent on its own discounted oil sales to many of the same Chinese buyers now refusing Iranian cargo, has no excess capacity to support Tehran beyond symbolic diplomatic statements. Beijing, calculating that direct intervention to rescue Iranian oil exports would trigger exactly the kind of American secondary sanctions response it has been carefully avoiding through years of strategic patience, has offered diplomatic statements but no concrete commitments to financial or logistical support that would meaningfully alter the trajectory. The countdown has begun and the timelines are compressing faster than even pessimistic Iranian internal assessments anticipated. Within 10 to 15 days, according to industry analysts cited by S&P Global Platts and Energy Intelligence, Iran will face the absolute decision point on whether to begin forced production shutdowns that will permanently damage reservoir capacity at major fields. Within 30 days, the funding crisis will begin affecting proxy network operations in ways that become visible to external observers monitoring Hezbollah salary payments, Houthi weapons deliveries, and Iraqi militia activity levels. Within 60 days, the domestic economic consequences will reach the threshold that previous regime crises have indicated triggers significant internal unrest, extending beyond traditional protest patterns into potential systemic challenges. This is a structural turning point in the history of the Islamic Republic. This damage is permanent across every dimension of the system. The shadow fleet infrastructure, built through years of careful evasion engineering and relationship cultivation across compromised flag states and complicit service providers, cannot simply be reconstituted once dismantled through targeted financial pressure on the supporting ecosystem. The financial relationships severed by Chinese refinery compliance decisions cannot easily be rebuilt once the precedent is established that American banking system access takes priority over discounted crude arrangements. The reservoir damage from forced shutdowns cannot be reversed through any subsequent investment or technical intervention based on current petroleum engineering knowledge. The regime credibility lost during this crisis cannot be restored, even if oil exports eventually resume at significantly reduced levels through whatever recovery arrangement emerges. There is no going back to the pre-crisis equilibrium that sustained the Islamic Republic for nearly half a century since the revolution. The geopolitical implications extend far beyond Iran itself into the fundamental architecture of American economic statecraft. The successful application of integrated sanctions pressure combining maritime enforcement, financial system leverage, and secondary pressure on Chinese entities establishes a template that will reshape American policy approaches for the coming decades across multiple theaters. The demonstration that Chinese teapot refineries can be deterred from sanctioned crude purchases fundamentally alters assumptions about the limits of American financial power in the era of strategic competition with Beijing across every dimension. The collapse of Iran's primary revenue stream creates immediate questions about the sustainability of Iranian-backed operations from Lebanon to Yemen that have shaped regional dynamics for 2 generations of American Middle East policy. For American interests, the implications are extraordinary across every strategic dimension. The energy security advantages of dramatically reduced Iranian export capacity strengthen the position of allied producers, including Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, in ways that reinforce broader regional alignments. The financial pressure on Iranian proxy networks reduces threats to American forces and allies across the Middle East, from the Eastern Mediterranean through the Persian Gulf to the Red Sea. The demonstration of effective sanctions architecture provides leverage in negotiations with Tehran on nuclear program limitations that previous administrations could not achieve through years of frustrated diplomacy. The precedent established for compelling Chinese compliance with American sanctions creates new tools for managing strategic competition with Beijing across multiple domains far beyond the immediate Iranian context. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications without delay. This analysis will continue tracking every major development in this rapidly evolving crisis as it unfolds across the coming critical weeks. The next 72 hours will reveal whether Iran begins emergency production shutdowns at major fields, whether additional Chinese refineries follow the precedent set by early defectors and accelerate the export collapse, and whether the regime attempts dramatic responses, including potential military escalation in the Strait of Hormuz, designed to break out of the economic encirclement through forced renegotiation. Every one of these scenarios carries enormous implications for global energy markets, regional security architecture, and American strategic interests across the next decade of Middle East policy. Drop your thoughts in the comments below right now. Do you think Iran will accept the permanent damage of forced production shutdowns to preserve future capacity for eventual recovery? Or will the regime attempt military escalation in the Strait of Hormuz as a desperate response to economic strangulation that threatens the survival of the political system itself? Every single comment on this channel gets read carefully because the questions raised by this audience consistently identify dimensions of these crises that deserve deeper analysis in subsequent videos covering the unfolding situation. Thank you for watching this complete analysis. Stay informed, stay ahead of the conventional reporting, and the next brief will examine the specific military scenarios Tehran is reportedly considering as the countdown to forced shutdowns approaches its critical threshold in the coming days.